January 1946. The war is over. Across Europe, the guns have fallen silent, but the ground is still scarred. Rail yards stretch for miles, packed with steel shapes that no longer move. Rows of tanks sit nose to tail beneath winter skies. Their paint is chipped. Their tracks are rusting. Snow gathers in the grooves of armor once warmed by engines and men. These machines crossed beaches, smashed hedgerows, burned through cities, and climbed mountain roads under fire. They were built for urgency, for survival, for a war that demanded speed over perfection. Now they wait. American crews have gone home. Barracks are empty. Depots are sealed. Clerks inventory what remains of the largest armored force ever assembled. Nearly 50,000 tanks built in less than 5 years. Far more than any battlefield can absorb in peacetime. The question hangs quietly over the wreckage of victory. What happens to a weapon designed for total war when the war ends? Does it disappear into scrap in memory? Does it evolve? Or does it find new wars waiting beyond the horizon? The answer lies not in triumph, but in what followed. By the summer of 1945, the industrial heartbeat of the United States slowed for the first time in nearly 4 years. Factories that had run day and night fell quiet. Assembly lines that once turned raw steel into armored vehicles by the hour stopped abruptly, as if the war itself had simply exhaled and let go. The scale of what remained was unprecedented. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry had produced 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks in dozens of variants. They had been shipped across 2 oceans, landed on hostile shores, and pushed deep into enemy territory. By the time the last shots were fired, Sherman sat in France, Germany, Italy, the Pacific Islands, North Africa, Britain, and the continental United States, often in vast, unguarded fields that stretched beyond the horizon. The war had demanded quantity. Peace demanded reckoning. The U.S. Army faced a problem no nation had ever confronted on this scale. What to do with tens of thousands of armored fighting vehicles now rendered surplus almost overnight. Maintaining them was expensive. Transporting them home was often pointless. Scrapping them outright risked destroying assets that had cost enormous resources to build. At the same time, the world itself was unstable. Europe was shattered. Cities lay in ruins. Rail networks barely functioned. Many Allied armies had been demobilized to skeleton forces, their armored units dissolved or depleted. Across Asia, colonial powers were returning to territories where authority was no longer guaranteed. And in Eastern Europe, a new military reality was forming, one that Washington understood only dimly in 1945. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with the largest land army on Earth. Its tank forces, hardened by years of mechanized warfare, did not demobilize at the same pace. Red Army formations remained intact from Berlin to the borders of Iran. For American planners, the end of World War II did not feel like security. It felt like uncertainty. The Sherman tank, once a wartime necessity, suddenly became a strategic reserve. Official evaluations conducted in late 1945 and early 1946 reached a sober conclusion. Against the heaviest tanks of the future, the Sherman was already outdated. Its armor was thin by emerging standards. Its main guns, effective in 1944, struggled against newer designs, yet remained mechanically reliable easy to maintain, and familiar to thousands of trained crews. In a world that might need to rebuild armies quickly, familiarity mattered. Large numbers of Shermans were placed into long-term storage. Others were cannibalized for parts. Many were quietly scrapped, their steel melted down to fuel civilian reconstruction. But a significant portion remained intact, preserved not because they were perfect, but because they were available. This decision was not driven by nostalgia or sentiment. It was driven by logistics. New tanks were expensive. Research programs took years. Budgets were shrinking as the American public demanded a return to normal life. The Sherman offered a bridge between war and whatever came next, a way to keep armored forces alive without committing to a new generation of vehicles too soon. As 1946 turned into 1947, global politics began to harden. Former allies eyed each other with suspicion. Military planners dusted off contingency plans. And in quiet depots around the world, the Sherman waited, not as a relic, but as a tool still considered useful. Its war was over, but its service was not. By 1947, the optimism that followed victory had begun to erode. Political alliances shifted. Former battle lines hardened into ideological borders. What had been a global war was slowly transforming into something colder, but no less dangerous. For the United States and its allies, the problem was immediate and practical. Armies had been demobilized at breathtaking speed. Millions of soldiers returned home. Entire armor divisions were dissolved. Yet the responsibility of maintaining security in Europe and Asia remained. The Sherman tank filled the gap. In American assessments, the M4 was no longer considered a frontline weapon against the most modern armored threats. But it remained adequate for internal security, training, and rapid force regeneration. Its mechanical simplicity meant that it could be operated by conscripts and reservists with minimal retraining. Spare parts existed in overwhelming abundance. Field repairs required no advanced infrastructure. In short, it was a tank that could keep armies alive while doctrine caught up with reality. This logic shaped early Cold War planning. As Western European nations struggled to rebuild their militaries from ruins, the United States faced a choice: wait years for new tank designs to mature, or arm allies immediately with what already existed. The answer became policy. Through early military assistance programs that predated formal Cold War aid structures, Shermans were transferred in significant numbers to friendly governments. These tanks were not gifts of charity. They were strategic tools. Each Sherman placed in a service abroad represented one more armored unit that could delay, resist, or complicate any future aggression. In Britain, France, and Italy, the Sherman remained a familiar sight. Many had fought in them only years earlier. Training manuals already existed. Maintenance crews knew every bolt and bearing. Reintroducing the tank required little adaptation. Beyond Europe, the Sherman's value grew even more apparent. In Asia, the balance of power was fragile. The defeat of Japan had created a vacuum across the region. Civil wars, independence movements, and proxy conflicts erupted almost immediately. Armored forces were scarce. Industrial capacity was limited. The Sherman, shipped in crates or refurbished from stored stocks, became the fastest way to field credible armor. The tank also found a role within the U.S. Army itself. While newer designs were tested and debated, Shermans remained in use at training facilities and reserve units. They serve as instructional platforms for gunnery, maneuver, and combined arms coordination. Young officers learned armored warfare inside a machine whose limitations were already well understood, often considered a benefit rather than a flaw. Yet beneath this practicality lay an uncomfortable truth. The world was changing faster than the Sherman could. Combat experience from the later years of World War II had already exposed its vulnerabilities. Heavier enemy guns, improved armor designs, shaped charge weapons. Engineers could improve it, but only so far. Each upgrade added weight, complexity, and strain to a design originally optimized for mass production. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, American analysts recognized that a future war would not resemble the last. The Sherman could delay an enemy. It could support infantry. It could patrol unstable regions. But it could not dominate a modern battlefield indefinitely. Still, in the late 1940s, there was no immediate replacement ready in sufficient numbers. The tank that had won by being everywhere now lingered because nothing else could take its place quickly enough. The Sherman had survived the war not because it was the best, but because it was useful. That usefulness would soon be tested again, not in theory, but under fire. For the men who had fought inside the Sherman, peace did not arrive all at once. Tank crews demobilized quickly, but thousands remained in uniform, reassigned to occupation duty, training units, or newly reconstituted armored formations. Many found themselves climbing back into the same steel holes they had left months earlier, now parked neatly instead of hurriedly concealed. The experience was disorienting. Inside, nothing had changed. The cramped turret, the smell of oil and metal, the familiar vibration of the engine, the same periscopes, the same gun sights. But outside, there was no enemy, no urgency, no fire. For instructors, the Sherman became a teaching tool. Veterans passed on hard-earned lessons to recruits who had never seen combat. Gunnery drills were methodical, maneuvers deliberate. Mistakes were corrected calmly, not under fire. Yet the limitations were impossible to ignore. Crews who had faced late-war enemy tanks knew exactly what the Sherman could and could not do. Its armor inspired less confidence than it once had. Its gun demanded careful positioning. Survival depended on coordination, terrain, and numbers rather than brute strength. Still, many preferred it to the unknown. It was predictable. It responded the same way every time. In a post-war army trying to redefine itself, that reliability offered reassurance. The Sherman no longer represented victory. It represented continuity. On paper, post-war armor doctrine shifted rapidly. Military thinkers studied deep operations, mobile warfare, and the lessons of mechanized combat refined between 1939 and 1945. Tanks were expected to fight other tanks more often. Firepower and protection became central concerns. Measured against these expectations, the Sherman struggled. Its design reflected earlier priorities: ease of production, mechanical reliability, and logistical flexibility. Against infantry and light defenses, it remained effective. In support roles, it performed well. But against modern armored threats, it required careful handling. Tactically, the Sherman demanded cooperation. It worked best when paired with infantry, artillery, and air support. Alone, It was vulnerable. Commanders understood this and adjusted accordingly. Units trained to avoid head-on engagements with heavier tanks. Terrain was used aggressively. Flanking and coordination became essential. This did not make the Sherman obsolete, but it narrowed its role. Armies that continued to rely on it did so with clear-eyed realism. It was a platform to be managed, not a weapon to be trusted blindly. Tactical doctrine compensated for technological limits, buying time until replacements arrived. In this way, the Sherman shaped post-war armored thinking, not by setting new standards, but by exposing where old ones failed. Perhaps the Sherman's most lasting post-war contribution came not on battlefields, but on training grounds. Because its weaknesses were well known, instructors used it to teach discipline. Crews learned that armor alone was not protection. That positioning mattered. That communication saved lives. That tanks did not fight alone. New officers trained on Shermans were forced to think beyond firepower. They planned routes carefully. They coordinated with infantry units. They learned to respect enemy capabilities rather than assume superiority. In this sense, the Sherman became a corrective tool. It prevented complacency. It punished carelessness. And it instilled habits that would carry over to newer, more capable machines. Yet doctrine could only compensate so much. The tank's continued use raised an inevitable question. How long could training and tactics offset aging steel? The answer would arrive not in classrooms or exercises, but in combat once again. By the late 1940s, the Sherman was no longer competing with the tanks it had once faced. It was being measured against an entirely new generation of armored warfare. Its core design dated back to 1941. Even with upgrades, improved guns, reinforced armor plates, better radios, the basic structure remained unchanged. The hull geometry offered limited protection against shaped charge weapons. Its suspension, reliable but dated, restricted weight growth. Every improvement strained an airframe never meant to carry it. Engineers understood the problem clearly. There was only so much that could be done without redesigning the tank entirely. Attempts to modernize the Sherman continued. Higher velocity guns were fitted. Ammunition storage was improved to reduce fire risk. Armor was thickened in places. But each modification added weight, reducing mobility and mechanical longevity. The tank became heavier without becoming fundamentally stronger. The pace of change outside the Sherman accelerated. Anti-tank weapons grew more lethal. New tank designs emphasized thicker frontal armor, lower silhouettes, and more powerful main guns. Jet aircraft and attack aircraft introduced new vulnerabilities from above. The Sherman could survive in this environment, but only with caution and support. Technologically, it was becoming a bridge to nowhere. During World War II, the Sherman had benefited from unpredictability and mass. By the late 1940s, neither advantage remained. Potential adversaries studied it carefully. In the Soviet Union, analysts had already encountered the Sherman during the final push into Germany. They had examined captured vehicles, evaluated armor thickness, gun performance, and mechanical reliability. They understood its strengths and its limits. From their perspective, the Sherman was not feared. It was categorized. Its gun was judged insufficient against newer Soviet armor designs. Its silhouette was tall. Its armor profile was vulnerable to contemporary anti-tank munitions. Against disciplined opposition, it was seen as a manageable threat. This assessment mattered. Military planning is shaped not only by what a weapon can do, but by what the enemy believes it can do. As the Sherman's reputation shifted from battlefield workhorse to known quantity, its deterrent value diminished. The tank that had once won through numbers now faced enemies who planned around its presence rather than feared it. As Shermans flowed outward from American depots, a quieter question emerged. What responsibility came with exporting the weapons of a finished war? Many recipient nations lacked alternatives. For them, the Sherman was not obsolete. It was transformative. It offered mobility, firepower, and a sense of sovereignty. It also carried risks. Crews trained on older tanks faced modern threats. Governments armed themselves with machines that might draw them into conflicts they were not prepared to fight. In regions already tense, the arrival of armored units altered calculations overnight. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Middle East, where Shermans would later be modified, upgunned, and driven back into combat by nations such as Israel, long after the tank's original designers had moved on. These were not symbolic gestures. These were decisions with consequences measured in lives. The Sherman, once built to end a global war, now moved quietly into smaller ones, carrying with it the weight of an earlier conflict repurposed for new struggles. It was no longer just a machine. It was a legacy in motion, and soon that legacy would be tested where theory ended, on real battlefields under real fire once again. June 1950. The illusion of peace collapsed without warning. On the Korean Peninsula, the border hardened by politics dissolved into violence. Armored columns surged south. Infantry followed. Within days, it was clear that this was not a minor conflict, but the first major test of the post-war world order. For the United States and its allies, the shock was immediate and severe. Occupation forces in Japan were lightly equipped. Many frontline units had no modern tanks available at all. The armored formations envisioned in planning documents existed largely on paper. What could be moved quickly was what already existed, and that meant the Sherman. Store vehicles were rushed back into service. Crews were assembled hastily. Tanks that had sat idle for years were inspected, repaired, and loaded onto transports. Some still bore markings from World War II. Others were repainted in a matter of days. They were going back to war. On arrival, the battlefield looked unfamiliar. Narrow valleys, steep hills, poor roads, weather that punished engines and men alike. But the greatest shock came from the enemy's armor. For the first time, Sherman crews faced mass-produced tanks derived from wartime Soviet design philosophy. Vehicles with heavier armor, lower silhouettes, and more powerful guns. Engagements that once favored maneuver and coordination now demanded direct confrontation. The results were sobering. In early clashes, Shermans found themselves outmatched in head-on fights. Their guns struggled to penetrate frontal armor. Enemy rounds punched through at ranges previously considered safe. Crews adapted quickly, using terrain, ambush, and coordination, but losses mounted. This was not the Sherman's war, yet it did not collapse. The tank proved mechanically resilient under harsh conditions. It could climb where heavier vehicles struggled. It could be repaired in the field. And when properly employed, It could still destroy enemy armor through flanking shots and coordinated attacks. Commanders adjusted doctrine in real time. Shermans were used aggressively in support roles. Infantry and artillery coordination became essential. Air power compensated where steel could not. The tank that had once symbolized American industrial dominance now symbolized improvisation. It was no longer the decisive weapon, but it was the weapon available. As the fighting intensified, one reality became undeniable. The Sherman could fight, but it could not define the battlefield anymore. Every engagement reinforced the same conclusion. The future of armored warfare had already moved on. The war exposed the Sherman's limits not in theory, but in blood and wreckage. And with each loss, the question grew sharper. How long could the old warhorse keep pace with a new kind of war? By late 1950, the verdict was no longer academic. Reports from the front were blunt. The Sherman could still fight, but only under increasingly narrow conditions. When forced into direct engagements against newer armored designs, its survival depended on luck, positioning, and support rather than inherent advantage. Commanders did not need theoretical studies to understand the shift. They were watching it unfold in real time. Armored doctrine began to change under pressure. The Sherman was reassigned away from roles that demanded tank versus tank dominance. It was used to support infantry advances, to exploit breakthroughs created by other forces, and to hold ground rather than seize it. In these roles, it remained valuable, but the battlefield hierarchy was clear. The tank was no longer at the top. This realization accelerated decisions already forming within Western militaries. Development programs that had moved slowly in the late 1940s were now pushed forward with urgency. Armor thickness increased. Gun calibers grew. Silhouettes dropped. Protection against shaped charges and high-velocity rounds became non-negotiable requirements. Within the U.S. Army, new armored vehicles entered service that reflected these lessons. Compared side by side, the difference was unmistakable. Where the Sherman emphasized reliability and production efficiency, its successors emphasized survivability and firepower. Weight was no longer avoided. Complexity was accepted. The Sherman had reached the edge of its evolutionary path. Loss figures reinforced the conclusion. While exact numbers varied by unit and engagement, after-action reports consistently showed higher vulnerability when Shermans encountered modern armor without overwhelming support. Crews adapted, but adaptation could not erase physics. Steel thickness mattered. Gun velocity mattered. Profile mattered. By the early 1950s, frontline American armored units began transitioning away from the Sherman entirely. It remained present, but increasingly in secondary roles, reserve formations, and Allied hands. The turning point was not a single battle. It was a pattern. Each engagement confirmed what engineers and analysts already knew. The Sherman had been designed for a different war. Its continued use was a necessity, not a choice. And as soon as alternatives became available in meaningful numbers, the decision was made quietly but decisively. The Sherman would no longer be the backbone of major Western armored forces. But that did not mean its story ended. As one chapter closed, another opened, far from the centers of power where its obsolescence was declared. Across the world, nations with fewer options looked at the same tank and saw something different. Not a relic, but an opportunity. Once the United States and Western Europe began withdrawing the Sherman from frontline service, the tank did not disappear. Instead, it found a second life in unexpected places. Nations that lacked the resources, infrastructure, or industrial base to produce their own armored vehicles. In Israel, the Sherman arrived in the late 1940s as part of post-war surplus transfers. At the time, the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces had virtually no tanks. Shermans became the backbone of armored units during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Engineers and crews modified the tanks extensively. Heavier guns were mounted, additional armor plates welded to vulnerable areas, and mobility improved through suspension upgrades. What was considered obsolete by American standards became decisive in a region still learning modern warfare. Similarly, in Latin America, Shermans were exported to nations like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. These tanks, though aging, were often the most powerful armored vehicles in national inventories. They provided governments with mobile striking capability and, in some cases, served as symbols of prestige. In training exercises, the tanks allowed smaller militaries to develop armor doctrine without the prohibitive costs of designing or purchasing modern tanks. Across Asia, Shermans were pressed into service in post-colonial conflicts. In India and Pakistan, surplus vehicles were refurbished and adapted to local conditions. The tanks operated in rough terrain and tropical climates, often requiring field modifications to survive mud, monsoon rains, and extreme heat. Crews learned to rely on clever positioning and combined arms tactics to offset their machines' vulnerability to modern weaponry. Even decades after World War II, the Sherman remained in combat. Its durability, simplicity, and availability made it invaluable where newer tanks were scarce. In North Africa, Middle Eastern nations, and Southeast Asia, the Sherman became a platform for experimentation. New armament, makeshift reactive armor, and upgraded engines extended its life far beyond its original design. The post-war story of the Sherman was therefore not one of obsolescence alone. It became a tool of statecraft, a means of defense, and in some cases, a weapon that could tip the balance in local conflicts. Its steel, once forged to fight the largest war in history, was now shaping the outcomes of much smaller, yet no less significant battles. The same tank that had failed to dominate against newer designs in Korea now proved adaptable, enduring, and unexpectedly relevant, reminding the world that usefulness is not always measured by technical superiority alone. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Sherman's global role had begun to diminish. Western armies, flush with new designs like the M48 Patton and the Centurion, gradually retired their Shermans from active service. They were moved to storage depots, converted into training vehicles, or scrapped to recover steel. Across Europe and North America, vast fields of idle tanks became silent monuments to a war that had ended decades earlier. In the United States, some Shermans were preserved at training ranges, used to teach crews about armor, gunnery, and battlefield repair. Others were cannibalized for spare parts to support remaining reserve units or allied militaries still dependent on them. Museums and memorials began acquiring historically significant examples. Today, surviving Shermans can be found in nearly every continent, restored, displayed, or maintained in running condition for historical reenactments. Elsewhere, Shermans lingered in the arsenals of nations that could not yet afford replacements. In the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia, They continued to serve into the late 1960s and 1970s. Many were modified heavily, more powerful guns, improved armor plating, even diesel engine conversions to extend operational life. In some cases, they faced modern tanks in combat, proving that even an obsolete design could still influence outcomes if used cleverly. At the same time, the tank became a symbol. For historians and veterans, it represented the industrial might that had won World War II. For soldiers still training on them, it was a tangible reminder of lessons learned under fire. And for nations that had fought with Shermans in post-war conflicts, it was a tool that bridged eras, a connection between the massive industrial wars of the 1940s and the regional conflicts of the Cold War. Ultimately, the Sherman's afterlife reflected a balance between practicality and memory. Some were scrapped, returning steel to industry. Some were stored, awaiting an uncertain future. And some were remembered, preserved for posterity, testimony to the machines that had carried men through the most destructive war in human history. Even as its role on the battlefield ended, the Sherman's story continued. Its presence felt not only in military doctrine, but in the shaping of armored warfare for generations to come. The story of the Sherman tank after World War II is not merely about steel and firepower. It is a story about adaptation, necessity, and the human dimension of warfare. It reminds us that weapons do not exist in isolation. They exist in the context of politics, logistics, and human skill. A machine built to overwhelm the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific became, in peacetime, a bridge between wars, an instrument of continuity in an uncertain world. For the crews who climbed back into its turret, it offered familiarity and a measure of reassurance. For nations struggling to rebuild or defend themselves, it offered mobility, firepower, and hope. And for military planners, it offered a lesson in pragmatism, that utility often outweighs innovation, at least temporarily, in the face of necessity. Yet the Sherman also embodies limits. Its obsolescence was inevitable. Its armor could not withstand the weapons of the new era. Its gun could not penetrate the tanks that would dominate future battlefields. And yet, even in decline, it adapted. It was modified, upgraded, and repurposed. It survived in conflicts far removed from its original design intent. Perhaps this is the Sherman's most enduring legacy, that the life of a weapon extends far beyond its first battle. Its story is not confined to history books or museums. It lives in the training of soldiers, the strategy of nations, and the memories of those who fought within and around it, in steel and in service. The Sherman reminds us that warfare is never only about the present. It is about the consequences that ripple forward, shaping conflicts, nations, and lives for decades to come. The war may have ended. The tanks may have grown old. But the Sherman, in all its flawed resilience, continued to move through history, quietly proving that sometimes endurance matters more than perfection.